I've long been very sympathetic to the idea, which is especially prominent in Eastern Christianity, that the world as it is, if you like, a communication from God. Every environment we confront, every substance or reality we confront carries with it something of the divine activity, and therefore the divine gift. And it's expressed in Eastern Christian theology in terms of saying that there's one eternal divine word on which the whole of creation rests, and everything we meet is a sort of little word, an echo of that word. And that's an image which just keeps coming back for me as the fundamental dimension of my faith which relates to the environmental crisis. There is a word to be heard, there's a call to be answered. The call is to solidarity, to love, to nurture. So at the very beginning of the Bible, when we're given the creation story, often misunderstood that, there's this injunction to dominate the earth, so it seems. But before that, we're told God looks at the world and sees that it's good. And we, made in the image of God, we human beings made in the image of God, we have to see that it's good as well. And therefore, revere and work with the grain of the goodness of what there is. So I would say that the creation story, so far from giving us license to do what we damn well like with the environment, actually tells us we're supposed to be looking at it with attention and praise and appreciation and a sort of humility too. We often get humility wrong. We think humility is self-abasement or something like that. But it's really knowing your limits, knowing that you have a place within a system. You're not the whole system. And to talk about an ecology at all is to talk about a balance of interlocking, mutually dependent, and mutually, serving, nurturing activities. We belong in that network. We don't live outside it, we don't live above it. And so that kind of recognition of who we are, which says we're not everything. We have a distinctive role, but we're not everything. That, I think, is the key to humility. Some years ago, there was a campaign, Jubilee 2000, which was all about forgiving debts of heavily indebted nations, asking the so-called developed economies to basically to write off debts of a lot of poorer nations. And the Jubilee idea, from which the title came, is something you find in the Hebrew Scriptures and the Old Testament as a moment of a kind of pause in proceedings. You stop the endless cycle of acquisition and labor and enslavement. You just stop it. Every 7 years you take certain steps. Every 70 years you take certain steps. Every 50 years you take certain steps. Because there's a need for a kind of sabbatical in your acquisitiveness and go back to square one. So that meant in those terms also freeing of slaves after a 7-year period, but it also entailed something to do with the land itself. You let the land lie fallow for a period, as a reminder that you didn't actually own the land. God was lending it to you to use for what you needed. But once in a while, you just needed to stop and say, this is given to me for what I need. It's not an absolute possession. And the Jubilee ideal, both in regard to how we treat other human beings and in regard to how we treat the natural environment, I think is one of the things that draws together what often fall apart in contemporary discourse, the imperative of justice for the poor, the imperative of justice for the environment. I think we've come to see more clearly in the last, 10 years or so, that environmental issues are not in fact separate from issues around the well-being of vulnerable people around the world, because it's those vulnerable populations who suffer most from environmental degradation. So we are making the connections. But there they are in that biblical text, I think, put very vividly. We need a sabbatical from our greed, from our obsessive exploitation. Changing our habits, our ways of life, because of the ecological crisis, is not simply about problem solving. We may or may not solve the problem. It may not work. We may, as a human race, be in our last phase. But it's still worth changing our lives, because the relation we currently have to the world around us is simply unhealthy. It's not good for any of us. If we want to be more human, it's worth doing, even if, in 50 and 100 years' time, we have not turned around the present crisis. I hope and pray that we shall. But what if we don't? Well, we don't just sit back and wait for the night to fall. We still have the task of finding ways of relating better, more honestly, more joyfully to where we are. And I've often quoted a saying that's sometimes ascribed to Martin Luther: if I knew the world would end tomorrow, I would plant a tree. In other words, if it's worth doing, it's worth doing. Results will look after themselves. All of us are mortal. All of us are going to die. It's conceivable that the human race will die before very long. It's going to die anyway one day, when we all collapse into the sun or whatever. The point is not to stave off disaster with endless anxiety, ratcheting up the anxiety and the fear. The thing is to learn how to live, as I said, with honesty and with humility, as we are now, because that is the path to a life that death doesn't end. I don't just mean if we live well we go to heaven. I mean that we begin now to live in the presence of truth and reality and divine love. And we live more fully now. And that is, I think, one of the things that faith says. Death is inevitable, and it's also irrelevant at one level. So start now.